Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Blackwood. I'm the president of Ralston College, and it is an immense honor to welcome you here this evening to our inaugural Sophia Lectures series with Professor Douglas Hedley of the University of Cambridge. The Sophia Lecture series is intended to explore the perennial questions of philosophy. Let's call them ultimate questions, as they bear on the meaning and value of modern life. While the lecture series is going to aim, both this one and all future ones that we hope to host, to make sense of our contemporary moment, we'll aim to do so through the study of Western culture's foundational texts, ideas, and spiritual insights. We have serious intellectual work to do in our time, serious thinking to do. And we have tonight someone who is going to help us and lead us in that serious thinking, tonight and for the next 4 Mondays. That is the professor of the philosophy of religion and the director of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism at the University of Cambridge, Douglas Hedley. Professor Hedley studied philosophy and theology at the universities of Oxford and Munich, and in 1992 gained a doctorate in the philosophy faculty at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich under the supervision of the great Werner Bayerwaltes. He is a former Templeton Fellow at the University of Notre Dame, Secretary of the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, and President of the European Society for the Philosophy of Religion. He has also held the Directeur d'études invitées at the École pratique des hautes études of the Sorbonne, been an Alan Richardson Fellow at the Theology Department in Durham, and was a Teep Lecturer in India in 2006. He is perhaps best known for his trilogy of works on the imagination, which bear the titles Living Forms of the Imagination, which appeared in 2008, Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred in 2011, and finally in 2016, The Iconic Imagination. It is not just Dr. Hedley's sheer range across the philosophical, theological, and literary landscape that so impresses. It is the fact that he matches that breadth with extraordinary depth, going after the very deepest and perennial questions that have troubled thinkers from ancient times to our own. I would be remiss if I did not mention that in the last couple of years there has been a book written about the thought of Douglas Hedley. That is The History of Religious Imagination in Christian Platonism, exploring the philosophy of Douglas Hedley. And I'd like to read you just a sentence from that description. This collection provides the first in-depth introduction to the theory of the religious imagination put forward by renowned philosopher Douglas Hedley, from his earliest essays to his principal writings. This book sheds light on his robust concept of religious imagination as the chief power of the soul's knowledge of the divine, and reveals its importance in contemporary metaphysics, ethics, and politics. Dr. Hedley not only teaches at the University of Cambridge, but is also, and I hope you'll have some intuition of what I mean by this, an archetypal college man. He has been a fellow of Clare College since 1998. Clare College, if you don't know it, at Cambridge, is among the most beautiful colleges anywhere, and among the oldest, too. It was founded as University Hall in 1326, and then renamed Clare Hall in 1338 after one of the most influential women of the 14th century, Elizabeth de Clare. You might say Clare College has this nearly 700 years of history at a university that's nearly 1,000 years. And the reason I dwell on those long time spans is because you get good at learning how to do things over 700 or 1,000 years. And Douglas has internalized the wisdom of that tradition, and so it's a great gift to us that he is here at the beginning of the founding, the operating of Ralston College here in Savannah for us to learn from him. He has it in his bones, you might say. Professor Hedley was born in Derbyshire and grew up on a farm, which to this day he still runs with his father. So he has a rich sense, you might say, of the whole spectrum of life as we live it, know it, and come to love it. He has a deep apprehension of the beautiful and admiration for the transcendent, and a huge capacity, I can tell you, for friendship. In some sense, our being here tonight, I should say, is in this particular house, in the Noble Hardy House, appropriate as we seek to do the deep thinking and reimagination and rediscovery and indeed rebuilding of our time. What better place than to be in this beautiful building from the mid-19th century, and yet one, as you can tell around you, that needs a lot of love, perhaps just like we do and just as our culture does. So I hope that this building, in some sense, our being here, this is exceptional. We're not yet operating in this building. It needs a lot of work before we can get there. But we've received exceptional permission to host these lectures here, and we hope that our being here will be a kind of rich metaphor, as one of our friends says, for the purpose of this college and of this series. I said we have hard thinking to do. You know, when you get down to the fundamental questions, there aren't that many. You know, there's what is the human being? What is the nature of the real? What is the relation between those things? This series and the topic of play, the spirit of play, will go right into all of those questions. Is there a principle that unites the play of animals, the simple games of children, the intricacy of fine art, and the paraphernalia of professional athletics? And what connection obtains between the free play of the imagination and the divine act of creation? These are questions that this series will richly entertain. As we seek to reimagine and rebuild the university, as we seek to reimagine what a college is, as we seek to reimagine and rebuild our culture, and above all, as we seek to reimagine and rediscover what the human being is and can be, I cannot think of a better person to lead, inspire, and illuminate us in that task. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our first Sophia lecturer, Professor Douglas Hedley.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for those very kind words. I must say that I am immensely grateful to Ralston College for the honor of this invitation. We are in a period, I think, of crisis in the humanities in particular, but nevertheless, that ancient question, know thyself, the question of the Delphic oracle, is still very much, I think, a question that should concern us in the humanities. And what I want to suggest to you this evening is that play may well be a key to understanding something about ourselves. Now, I'll start off with a quotation from Marsilio Ficino. Meanwhile, while our Plato discusses often in a hidden manner the duty belonging to mankind, it sometimes seems as though he is joking and playing. But Platonic games and jokes are much more serious than the serious things of the Stoics. So that's the motto for today's talk. Now, I will start by distinguishing play and game, or games. And I will be talking particularly about a couple of German writers, and of course in the German language one has the same word, Spiel, for both play and game, which is, I think, rather interesting. I will use play to refer to the more primordial form. So we find it, of course, among animals and infants. Games I will take to be more complex and rule-bound activities that emerge, I would say, out of the spirit of play. Now, this evening, I want to start off with looking at the thesis of Johann Huizinga in his magnificent seminal work, Homo Ludens, the man, the player, a study of the play element in culture. We'll come back to that subtitle in a bit. But also the Swiss-German novelist Hermann Hesse and the philosopher Josef Pieper. So Pieper's dates are 1904 to 1997, and many of you will know his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Now, Hesse and Huizinga were both writers who meditated on the idea of play, and both were painfully conscious of the decadence of European civilization in the wake of the great achievements of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Romantic eras. Therio ludere, to play seriously, the motto of many Renaissance thinkers, is a fitting maxim for these philosophical men of letters. Now, there are numerous parallels in their lives, even though they were rather different personalities. Neither is merely whimsical or frivolous. You certainly wouldn't expect that from the German, of course, who was a poet and an autodidact, and somewhat of a bohemian exile. The Dutchman was a learned professor writing explicitly ex cathedra. So in 1938, only a few years before the publication of Hermann Hesse's Nobel Prize-winning novel, The Glass Bead Game, the Dutch cultural historian Johann Huizinga finished his classic study, Homo Ludens, in which he argued that play is essential not just for understanding the behavior of children or adult sport, but for understanding higher cultural expressions such as poetry, the arts, law, religion, and philosophy as well. And in response to the spiritual crisis of Europe in the 20th century, both Huizinga and Hesse were deeply influenced by the tradition of Indian thought and by a radical Protestant piety, which both of them were inheritors of. At the same time, they were immersed in the European aesthetic and philosophical culture, and the minds of both were shaped by the brutal force of two world wars. Now, it's not my intent this evening, you'll be pleased to know, to offer a detailed analysis of either writer, but rather I wish to present both as offering a vantage point from which we might consider the question of the seriousness of play. Huizinga presents play as the very motor of culture, while offering at the same time a savage critique of what he calls the pluralism of his age, which he defines as a blend of adolescence and barbarity. We'll see that that's a critique of totalitarianism. Particularly, he was referring to the propaganda culture, the spectacles and the joyless conformism of communism and fascism. The motto of the Glass Bead Game is taken from the fictitious German scholastic Albertus Secundus. So don't worry if you haven't heard of him before. And this is the quote, "Nothing is harder, yet nothing more necessary than to speak of certain things whose existence is neither demonstrable nor probable. The very fact that serious and conscientious men treat them as existing things brings them a step closer to existence and the possibility of being born." And so the Huizinga notes that the word illusion means etymologically in play. It's from inlusio, illudere, or inludere. So play, in this sense, is an intimation of the sacred, since it's in the world, but not quite of it. Now, Huizinga was criticized for his emphasis upon the sacred dimension of play. I'm going to try to defend him. And Hesse's novel, similarly, is a depiction of an imaginary world, and yet it constitutes a very serious enterprise. We will find that the German philosopher Pieper reinforces this sense of the serious dimension of the ludic and the contemplative in human culture. Okay, so Huizinga on play. Now, Huizinga, as some of you will know, was a cultural historian. While he's best known as a medievalist, he actually started his career reading philosophy in his hometown of Groningen. And he studied Sanskrit in Leipzig. He became, in fact, a Sanskrit scholar and wrote his doctoral thesis on the notion of the vidushaka, the clown or the jester in Sanskrit drama. And my guess is that his early immersion in this Sanskrit Indic culture, where the idea of play or lila is absolutely central, came to then influence his view of Western culture, particularly when he changed into being a historian and examined, most famously, the great Burgundian culture of the late Middle Ages. For those of you who don't know, this idea of lila in Indic thought is tied to the idea of the cosmic dance. Some of you will be familiar, of course, with the dancing Shiva, and also the great stories of Krishna and the gopis as an image of the spiritual life. So this is an idea of the whole of the cosmos as being part of the a sort of cosmic lila or a cosmic play. So there's a thought that maybe Huizinga was influenced by this early immersion in Indic thought and then comes to see Western tradition and in the perspective of play. Now, Homo Ludens belongs to the end of Huizinga's career and was composed in a particularly harrowing period of European history in the 1930s. The period of the ascendancy of fascism and communism. I think you can see Huizinga as belonging to a tradition of the Dutch humanist Erasmus, and also a tradition going back to Schiller. Schiller, who famously said, "Man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, and he is only fully a human being when he plays." So the standpoint is philosophical rather than sociological. In many ways, we have a critique in that book of a materialistic, deterministic vision of society which stresses economics or politics for a vision sub specie ludi. As a historian, Huizinga is stressing the imaginative and as well anti-positivistic account of the past. And this is why play comes to be such a fundamental category. He defines it in relation to seriousness, they are opposed to seriousness, but the relationship is complex and paradoxical, resisting exact analysis. We might, he says, in a purely formal sense, call all society a game, if we bear in mind that this game is the living principle of all civilization. Now, this seems to be a strikingly counterintuitive thesis. Nevertheless, it is based upon a reflection about the nature of civilization. He writes, "Play is older than culture. For culture, however inadequately defined, always presupposes human society, and animals have not waited for man to teach them their playing." Huizinga insists that his book is about the play element of culture, not in culture. That is to say that play is not, for Huizinga, an isolated aspect of human culture, but it lies at its very source, and yet, at the same time, transcends culture. Now, he doesn't actually offer an exhaustive definition or analysis of play, but he does note certain characteristics. From the point of view of a world, he says, wholly determined by the operation of blind forces, play would be superfluous. Play only becomes possible, thinkable, and understandable when an influx of mind breaks down the absolute determinism of the cosmos. So his first point is a link between play and freedom. Secondly, play involves us stepping outside the realm of ordinary reality into a world of make-believe, but one highly valued in its own right, without being secondary or inferior. So Huizinga says, the inferiority of play is continually being offset by the corresponding superiority of its seriousness. Play turns to seriousness and seriousness to play. Play may rise to the heights of beauty and sublimity that leave seriousness far beneath. So here's this extraordinary thought that play is at the origins of culture, and yet at the very height of culture, then play is transcending the rest of culture. So play is occurring within a particular space and time, structured by arbitrary rules which serve as limits, and nevertheless inhabits a realm beyond the constraints of necessity or material utility. Thus, play is defined by an area or domain cut off from ordinary, inverted commas, life, spatially and temporally. It's a magical area. And this is why he says the spoil sport is often considered worse than a cheat, because the spoil sport destroys the illusion that's necessary for play. It is, he says, an activity which proceeds within certain limits of time and space, in a visible order, according to rules freely accepted and outside the sphere of necessity or material utility. The play mood, this is a wonderful passage, the play mood is one of rapture and enthusiasm, and is sacred or festive in accordance with the occasion. A feeling of exaltation and tension accompanies the action, mirth and relaxation follow. So we'll come back to this notion of the mood of rapture and enthusiasm. Now, though often competitive, play, Huizinga stresses, is disinterested. Often there's a lack of profit or immediate benefit to be gained from play. And although play elicits some amount of pleasure, joy, or enthusiasm, it's frequently defined by some tension. Play is often creative and imaginative, but not always, and replicates, imitates, or satirizes some aspect of ordinary life. Huizinga distinguishes between childlike play, paideia, and contest, the agon. Some languages, he says, reflect this difference, while others do not. I mean, one reason why he takes the term ludus is because the Latin term is so wide-ranging. So this deep link, however, between play and what he refers to as the agonistic principle is very important to the book. He reflects upon paradoxical parallels between the playground, the law court, and even the battlefield. The law court, he says, is a sacred spot cut off and hedged in from the ordinary world. Lawyers and judges take part in a game or contest of wits with the goal of winning. Huizinga dwells, for example, on the wigs worn by judges in British courts as evidence of the play element in legal proceedings. The wigs are evidently ludicrous in the familiar quotidian world. However, the apparently ludicrous nature of the wigs is paradoxically an indicator of the special seriousness of the law court. He notes the irony that the supreme age of genius, the 17th century, the age of Descartes, I think you've been studying Descartes today, Newton, Leibniz, and Spinoza, should also be the age of that comical object, the wig. Whereas, of course, with the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, reinforced democratizing trends, including the end of the wig. Huizinga uses chess as another example of serious play. Chess is clearly a game lacking utility. Nevertheless, all chess players are characteristically serious when they're playing. An even better instance is that of music. Music is a serious concern for both listeners and performers, but music, of course, we say, is played. While the capacity to create music and to appreciate it requires learning, abiding by its rules, such as scales and modes, at the same time, music is directed to the internal goods of aesthetic joy and acoustic beauty. While much music is blithe and gleeful, it still demands exceptional skill and accomplishment. And Huizinga places a particular emphasis upon music and dance as play. Now, various scholars have objected to Huizinga's attempt to explore the play element of culture. And a key criticism has been that of essentialism, the idea that he's referring to some timeless category that he's using in a rather Procrustean manner to explain a wide array of cultural phenomena. This, the critics say, produces a sweeping and overly simplistic account. But I think one response to this can actually be drawn from neuroscience. Huizinga notes that play is shared with other animals. He stresses this. The Estonian-American neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp was able to show that the play impulse belongs to a very primitive part of the brain shared by all mammals and many other animals. He coined the term affective neuroscience to refer to the tracing of emotional systems in animals, and he performed a series of experiments on rats. Rats apparently are very keen on playing. They wrestle with each other, and discovered that the play instinct is a very deep aspect of the evolutionary process in rats. He removed trigger warning, he removed the outer cortex of the brains of these rats, young rats, and nevertheless, despite the excision of the outer cortex of the brain, the rats continued to play, which suggests that the play instinct is a primordial part of the evolutionary process. The results of such neurophysiological research suggests that Huizinga's attempt to place play in a fundamental position in the explanation of culture has prima facie plausibility. If play is a deeply rooted feature of mammal behavior, there is evolutionary support for adducing play as an essential part of the human condition. And indeed, one can go further. So Robert Bellah, in his monumental work, Religion in Human Evolution, 2011, sees religion itself as the product of play. Bellah follows Huizinga when he argues that the concept of play is not just important for understanding child play and adult sports, but religion itself. So unlike Schiller, who was primarily concerned with play and human culture, Bellah is interested in the particular bond between play and religion. And Huizinga, while Huizinga, of course, as we've seen, claims that play is not just a human trait, for Bellah presents religion as emerging out of parental care, what he calls the mammalian play instinct. He says this is sheltered from selectionist pressures, and thus ritual provides a crucial social adhesive, generating larger social groups key to human development. The origins of Greek drama, of plays, in which the relation between actors and the audience was very intense, is of course very close to ritual. Think of the origins of tragedy in the religious cult of Dionysus. And one might here, of course, think of Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. So Beller's attempt to explain the emergence of religion as a phenomenon in terms of play, I think, is an interesting support for Huizinga's position. Now, as I've said, Huizinga is drawing on a particular Christian humanist tradition that stresses play as freedom, and one that you can find in Erasmus and the broader Renaissance tradition of the serio ludere, play seriously. There is, of course, one should also say, a tradition in the Christian West that is very critical of play or the game. And in fact, Huizinga says, the Christian ideal left but little room for the organized practice of sport and the cultivation of bodily exercise, except insofar as the latter contributed to general education. Indeed, he's right to say that there is a tradition of the critique of play within the Christian tradition. One might think of Tertullian in De Spectaculis, where he criticizes the circus, the Roman circus, the theatre or the amphitheatre, and the links to pagan rites and idolatry. And Tertullian's critique is mirrored in the modern period by Pascal, with his justly celebrated critique of the balls and the hunts and the games of the French aristocracy as a form of distraction, revealing the spiritual malaise of the human being. Kierkegaard, of course, would regard play culture extolled by Huizinga as abiding merely at the level of the aesthetic, as opposed to the ethical or the religion. And of course, many of you will be aware that Kierkegaard diagnoses boredom, anxiety, and despair as the major threats to the human psyche. He says, for the aesthete, boredom is the greatest terror. Huizinga, however, would answer these critics by saying that he's not claiming that play is an unmitigated good. Indeed, he notes that play can be negative. On occasion, it can be degenerate, as in the case of medieval tournaments or jousts. He writes, play, we began by saying, lies outside morals. In itself, it is neither good nor bad, he writes. But if we have to decide whether an action is a serious duty or is licit as play, our moral conscience will at once provide the touchstone. Now, what I want to stress in a way in this account of Huizinga is, again, that he's not merely a cultural historian, but there's a philosophical dimension to this, and the philosophical dimension he's drawing on is that of the Platonic tradition. We continue, he says, to speak of literature, incorrigible Neoplatonists as we all are, as an essentialism, and of literary culture as a group and an elite culture behind and above all general civilization. The references to Plato in Huizinga's Homo Ludens are varied, frequent, and always illuminating, and the kinship with Plato is evident. He liked to compare and contrast Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle's account of mimesis was significant for him, but Huizinga stressed that mimesis has a much broader meaning than representation. Indeed, imitation is pointing for him beyond nature to God. He says, Plato, however, turned matters around. It was not man but God who was the artist, and he played his game with the people. Man was God's plaything. Even Luther said that all creatures were masks of a hidden God, for whom the world is a theatre. So Huizinga is sensitive in this respect to the broader Platonic tradition. He notes that in Renaissance drama, life is compared to a play. Drama, he writes, in a glittering succession of figures ranging from Shakespeare to Calderon and Racine, then dominated the West. It was the fashion to liken the world to a stage on which every man plays his part. Does this mean that the play element in civilization was openly acknowledged? Not at all. On closer examination, this fashionable comparison of life to a stage proves to be little more than an echo of the Neoplatonism that was then in vogue, with a markedly moralistic accent. It was a variation on the ancient theme of the vanity of all things. And indeed, there is, moreover, a tradition of the Platonic doctrine of the Timaeus, of the creative divine principle as being without envy, and creation as the act of generous giving. And it's this Platonic sense of the goodness of God which finds vivid expression in the works of Meister Eckhart. So this is a really remarkable quote from the great medieval mystic. He says, "Now all things are alike in God and are God himself. Here in the sameness God finds it so pleasant that he lets his nature and his being flow in this sameness in himself. It is just as enjoyable for him as when someone lets a horse run loose on a meadow that is completely and level and smooth. Such is the horse's nature that it pours itself out with all its might in jumping about the meadow. So too does God find delights and satisfaction where he finds the sameness. He finds it a joy to pour his nature and his being completely into the sameness, for he is this sameness himself." Now we'll come to this theme of the Deus Ludens later on in the lecture series, but I just want to leave you with that notion that Huizinga is drawing on a particular Platonic tradition in his interest in play. The Glass Bead Game. The Swiss-German novelist Hermann Hesse drew upon his own deep theological inheritance, especially the Swabian pietism of his native region and the inheritance of his parents, both maternal and paternal, a missionary family indeed. His grandparents and parents had worked as missionaries in India, and Hesse had a fascination for Hindu and Buddhist thought. His mother indeed was born in India, and Hesse was sent to Maulbronn, the elite Swabian seminary where Kepler and Hölderlin had studied. His short stay in Maulbronn was personally disastrous, but it left a lasting impression on the writer. He was a sort of theologian manqué in a way. And it became a paradigm for an intellectual community in the novels of his maturity, particularly the Glass Bead Game. Hesse traveled to Asia in 1911, albeit largely Indonesia and only peripherally India. And you can see this in his novels like Journey to the East in 1932 and the very famous Siddhartha, published in 1922. But the final novel, The Glass Bead Game of 1943, might be seen as a critique of the elevated sense of the play spirit that we find in Huizinga. It's an allegorical novel constructed as a fictional biography of the master of the game, Josef Knecht, and set in Castalia. So some of the students, I'm sure, will recognize the Delphic origins of Castalia, a place devoted to the cultivation of human knowledge, of course, Castalia being the nymph of the prophetic springs of Delphi. The game is fundamental to the form of life in Castalia. It's played in public in the annual festival. And the novel is a fictional biography set in this imagined future Europe, where the province of Castalia is dedicated to the life of the mind. There, an elite scholarly order has been established to maintain mankind's intellectual inheritance, from mathematics to music to philology and to art. And there, the scholars play the glass bead game. Now, Hesse's novels usually contain two characters representing distinct types, the extrovert and the introvert, the worldly and the otherworldly. In this novel, Plinio Desinori, a hospitant, a brilliant aristocratic boy sent to the elite school, represents the former. So Plinio has a cynical attitude to the Glass Bead Game of Castalia as a form of escapism, as a sheer irresponsible playing around with an alphabet. Knecht, by contrast, embodying the latter institution, is a staunch defender of Castalia. Though a discussion with Plinio in the novel sows the seeds of doubt about the Glass Bead Game. So the theme of renunciation or affirmation of the world is a principal theme of the novel. So the Glass Bead Game, we never actually discover in the novel exactly what it is a profoundly elaborate game whose rules and structures are not defined. It's a blend of music, mathematics, and philosophy. There is, moreover, a contemplative aspect to this game, one which prevents the hieroglyphs of the game from degenerating into mere empty signs. Hesse is clear that Castalia has a theological dimension. It represented an elite, symbolic form of seeking for perfection, a sublime alchemy, an approach to that mind which is perhaps beyond all images and multiplicities, and one within itself, in other words, to God. So Hesse describes Castalia's development as it emerges in the aftermath of what is described as the age of the feuilleton. So the feuilleton, as you'll know in European newspapers, is the pages devoted to culture, but perhaps also to cultural gossip. So this is the representation for Hesse of a certain cultural decline, of an age lacking in intellectual depth, a lack compensated for by general cultural conversation and amusement and distraction. So this feuilleton culture is an escapism in a tumultuous setting, and one where the creative dimension of culture has been extinguished. So the realm of Castalia is seen as this kind of contrast to the decadent feuilleton culture. And here Hesse alludes frequently to Nicholas of Cusa, especially his great work De Ludo Globi, the bowling game, or game of the sphere, a great dialogue in which each player attempts to throw an odd-shaped ball or globe in a straight line, and the image of the game is rather an image of the paradoxes of what Cusa calls conjectural theology, or a symbolic theology. Think that the conjectura is the Latin equivalent of the synbalein, the throwing together in Greek. So it's a metaphor for life, thought, and contemplation. So so you can see how Hesse is drawing again on this long tradition of speculation, and particularly with Cusa, but also the name Knecht is servant or slave, laborer. This is also important because, of course, it's reminiscent of Hegel, of the master-slave dialectic. Knecht is a master, and yet he's also a servant. So indeed, the Christian dimension of the term, i.e. the Christ-like aspect of the suffering servant, may well be deliberate in Hesse. Now, whereas Huizinga is stressing the fertility of play, the idea of play as the basis of culture, and indeed the very height of culture being playful, Hesse seems to be presenting the erudite game of Castalia as bereft of creativity, almost an image of what Ralston should not become. So in a way, many scholars have seen the Glass Bead Game as an image of the failure of German intellectuals in the period of National Socialism. It's an image of a Mandarin domain of contemplative leisure, detached from the brutality of politics and the banality of the merely journalistic. So Hesse, mauled in public for his allegedly anti-German sentiment, seems to oscillate between recommending retreat from the domain of the everyday and then criticizing the sterility of the purely intellectual life as presented through the image of the Glass Bead Game. So, the critique of the Mandarin culture in the Glass Bead Game that one finds in Hesse's novel might be seen as opposing Huizinga's argument in Homo Ludens, because Huizinga, as we've seen, evidently believes in play and contest as having a civilizing function, and this as linked to what he calls the imperishable need of man to live in beauty. There is no satisfying this need, he says, save in play. In another passage, Huizinga writes of the play spirit as tied to a spirit that strives for honor, dignity, superiority, and beauty. Magic and mystery, heroic longings, the foreshadowings of music, sculpture, and logic all seek form and expression in noble play. Now, Huizinga, in contrasting this civilizing aspect of play with the barbarism that he saw overtaking Europe in the 1930s, viewed communism and fascism as expressing spiritual exhaustion and the apathy of an age of anxiety. He writes, this is Huizinga, "Things have now come to such a pass that the system of international law is no longer acknowledged or observed as the very basis of culture and civilized living. As soon as one member or more of the community of states virtually denies the binding character of international law and either in practice or in theory proclaims the interests and power of its own group, be it nation, party, class, church, or whatsoever else, as the sole norm of its political behavior, not only does the last vestige of the immemorial play spirit vanish, but with it, any claim to civilization at all. Society then sinks down to the level of the barbaric, and original violence retakes its ancient rights." So these words are directed at the erosion of the play spirit in the totalitarian regimes of the 1930s. What he calls the spectacle of society rapidly goose-stepping into helotry. In his work, The Shadow of Tomorrow, which was published in 1935, Huizinga was one of the most prominent critics of totalitarian Europe. And of course, it's easy to forget just how fragile parliamentary democracy was in 1938. I mean, almost all the great powers in Europe were totalitarian. The subtitle of the book is called A Diagnosis of the Modern Distemper, rather magnificent title. A cant phrase, he writes, in current German political literature speaks of the change from peace to war as das Eintreten des Ernstfalles, roughly the serious development of an emergency. In strictly military parlance, of course, the term is correct. Compared with the sham fighting of maneuvers and drilling and training, real war is undoubtedly what seriousness is to play. But German political theorists mean something more. The term Ernstfall avows quite openly that foreign policy has not attained its full degree of seriousness, has not achieved its object or proved its efficiency until the stage of actual hostilities is reached. The true relationship between the states is one of war. I know of no sadder or deeper fall from human reason than Schmidt's barbarous and pathetic delusion about the friend-foe principle. So this visceral critique of Carl Schmitt's neo-Hobbesian concept of the Ernstfall, which envisaged politics as strife between friend and foe, is viewed by Huizinga as the foundation of the murderous doctrine that man's nature is essentially predatory and that conquest is the justification of the state. Huizinga wrote before the publication of Homo Ludens, "It would seem more logical to replace the friend-foe opposition with that of the weak-strong. For friend means nothing more in this opposition, and foe simply means opponent. In the long run, however, there can be no permanent equality of opposing forces in any conflict. Thus, it seems that this thesis implies the unqualified recognition of the principle, might is right." By the way, Huizinga was arrested by the Germans in 1942, and after some months in a prison camp, he was placed under house arrest until he died in 1945. So this is the interesting context of the book Homo Ludens. It's not a claim about human culture as essentially frivolous. It's a, as one might say, paradoxically serious claim about the nature of human culture. Now, the religious aspect of this account of culture is, I think, particularly important and often unrecognized. Huizinga himself was descended from Baptist pastors. As a cultural historian, he stresses the religious aspect of play, especially ritual, which he sees as the primordial ground of play. Life for Huizinga is ritual, and ritual is play. The religious aspect of play is ubiquitous. It's the identification here of play and the sacred. He was particularly fascinated with what he calls the play festival rite complex. He writes, "All true ritual is sung, danced, and played. We moderns have lost the sense for ritual and sacred play. Our civilization is worn with age and too sophisticated. But nothing helps us to regain that sense so much as musical sensibility. In feeling music, we feel ritual. In the enjoyment of music, whether it is meant to express religious ideas or not, the perception of the beautiful and the sensation of holiness merge, and the distinction between play and seriousness is whelmed in that fusion." Now, I would want to say that the claim he's making is close to that made by Josef Pieper in his work published in German as Muse und Kult, and which you will know as the book translated as Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Now, the English translation, or title rather, is a paraphrase rather than a translation strictly. The German words are both, this is the words of the Pieper book, Muse und Kult, are both loan words with clear provenance in Greek and Latin, respectively. So the antique meanings of these words are of direct relevance for the argument of the book, because the word leisure in English has neutral associations. Leisure refers to the realm of not working, that can stretch from indolence to spirited cultivation of the kind that has been happening at Ralston for the last year among students and teachers. The leisured classes, of course, are those groups in English who are absolved from toil by their wealth. But the German Muse is derived from the Greek musa. It means leisure and even idleness, but has connotations of a more positive state, and indeed of the inspiration of the divine, the muse. Think of the muse in English. Kult is derived from the Latin cultus, and the word cultus denotes a system of worship and devotion, and the German derivative kult preserves this emphatically religious dimension. Now, it's easy to overlook the significance of this book by Pieper on leisure, Muse and Kult, arguing for the centrality of contemplation after the devastation of Germany in the wake of the Second World War. Of course, the book is a critique of the idolatry of work prior to the great achievement of the Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s and 1960s Germany, the economic miracle. And the original title makes more sense than the English translation of it, because Pieper is, of course, defending the humanities as an affirmation of the created order and links this to the justified longing for a principle of that order grounded in the transcendent. Pieper's book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, is an apology for play in the broader sense that, as we've seen, Huizinga was pleading for, far from celebrating sloth or leisure in this sense. Musse affirms, quote, man's happy and cheerful affirmation of his own being, his acquiescence in the world and in God, which is to say, love. He goes on further. It is, in the first place, an attitude of mind, a condition of the soul, and as such utterly contrary to the ideal of the worker. Work as activity, as toil, as social function. Leisure implies an attitude of non-activity, of inward calm, of silence. It means not being busy, but letting things happen. Leisure is a form of silence, of that silence which is the prerequisite of the apprehension of reality. So Musse, here translated as leisure, means the non-instrumental avowal of life, an appreciation of life as a gift, the gratitude for this gift rather than doing as such. This condition of the soul as a cheerful affirmation of life and inward calm is linked by Pieper to contemplation. It has obvious links to schole, from which we derive the word school. And we could think not only of Aristotle, what he says in the Ethics, Book 10, but also Cicero's depiction in De Oratore of the retirement of the successful man as otium cum dignitate, as related to this antique conception of dignified leisure in contrast to forced labor. So this is certainly not leisure as idleness, but contemplation and devotion in the etymological sense of devotion. Pieper is attacking an idolatry of work as the obsession with productivity, whether in the Weberian sense of the Protestant work ethic or the glorification of work for the benefit of the state in 20th century totalitarianism. He's contrasting such idolatries of work with the broadly Catholic vision of the feast and the festival as the profound affirmation of the human being participating in the divine. So here's another beautiful line from Pieper. The festival is the origin of leisure and its inward and ever-present meaning. In celebrating and holding festivals upon occasion, man experiences the world in an aspect other than the everyday one. If Musse or leisure is the position of a positive attitude to the world, the festival is the expression of the joy emerging therefrom. It provides, as it were, the foundation for fulfilling work, work deriving its significance from a sense of intrinsic value within the world. So the feast is not everyday life, but it affirms the meaning of life. Pieper says if real leisure is deprived of the support of genuine feast days and holy days, our holidays, work itself becomes inhuman. Celebration culminates in worship. Human beings celebrate various goods, but the liturgy of worship is celebration of the divine creation. The most festive festival it is possible to celebrate is the divine worship, since we cannot conceive a more intense affirmation of the world than praise of the creator of this world. So, if leisure embodies the acceptance of the world, liturgy is the assertion of transcendence, the expression of gratitude and joy. It is the thanksgiving for the world in relation to the supreme reality beyond it. So Musse, in German, unlike the English word leisure, has these associations that we've seen with inspiration, with the muses, those Greek goddesses who administered the arts. In worship, the proper attitude for Pieper is participation as well as praise. So as in Huizinga, that the play of art is not just mimesis, but metexis, not just imitation, but participation. And in the liturgy, of course, one participates in the divine life, and this is supposed to renew one's vocation and infusing the profane life with something more than just survival. Life becomes meaningful as the human being offers up gifts in return for the gift of creation. Huizinga, I think, is a good point at which for us to think about the significance of play within the broader culture. And as I've said, he's a writer drawing on the great tradition of Erasmus and the Renaissance humanists. There are affinities with Dante's Divine Comedy or Shakespeare's Fool, where we have playful engagement with sacred themes. Huizinga's stress on the paradoxical nature of play as grounded in our animal nature, and yet pointing to the highest forms of culture being playful, whether as law or philosophy or poetry or music, culture manifests play. And he's emphasizing the civilizing aspect of play. Play is not, as it were, merely a residual aspect of a deep evolutionary process. It's a key to some of the most elevated aspects of our experience. So as we said at the beginning, play is anterior to culture, but it's also superior to it, at least detached from it. Huizinga continues, in play we move below the level of the serious as the child does, but we can also move above it into the realm of the beautiful and the sacred. So to conclude, Hesse's philosophical novel, The Glass Bead Game, can be seen, as we've argued, as a presentation of the ambivalent dimension of the play aspect of culture in its Mandarin form. Pieper's book Leisure, The Basis of Culture, by way of contrast, can be seen as a resolute affirmation of play as a contemplative enjoyment of the world. There's a Puritan strand in Anglo-American culture that is suspicious of leisure. It's the suspiciousness which we think can be corrected. But this suspicion of leisure can be compounded by the grievance culture of those modern-day Jacobins who challenge the artes liberales as the product of social oppression and unjustifiable privilege. I'd want to suggest that the Dutch historian Huizinga suggests ways in which we can learn to appreciate and delight in the lasting importance of play for the cultivation of individuals, for humanity as a whole. And I think this concept is one of great significance in this inspiring recent institution, Ralston College. Thank you very much indeed.
The question I have is, there's a sense from your wonderful lecture in which play is outside of necessity, right? It's free from kind of determinism. But then there's another sense, and you bring this out wonderfully in your account of how deep it is in a kind of primordial evolutionary way. It must also be necessary for us to play. So in a way, it's necessary to transcend that necessity. And I'm wondering if you could reflect for a moment on, what happens if we don't play? What are the consequences of not stepping outside of, you might say, the necessary in the usual sense?
Well, I'm not sure this answers your question exactly, but it is quite clear psychologically that those human beings who can't play as children are really disturbed. So what one might call the Platonic paradox of play and seriousness is evidenced in the disturbed nature of adults, and I'm just going on psychological works that I've read here, who, for whatever reason, were not able to play as children. So there's plenty of evidence that suggests that play is a very necessary part of the development of a robust sense of identity in the adult. So I think not only can you mount an aesthetic argument of the kind that one finds in Schiller, and I'll be discussing later on in the lecture series, of the significance of play for art, but at a very profound psychological level, that the development of the human being into a serious agent depends upon the capacity for play at the stage of the child.
I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the role of the Middle Ages in this. You quoted Eckhart and Cusa, and of course the Dutch historian that you featured this evening,
Yep.
as you said, was perhaps best known for his book about the waning of the Middle Ages. Is there anything in that period that draws out the importance of play in the imagination of these German mystics that jumps to mind?
I will be looking at more detail at Nicholas of Cusa and the idea of the bowling game that he develops as a model for theology. But I think one might see what's going on in Huizinga as linked to a certain nostalgia for what he regards as the riches of European culture. And he sees the play element as a crucial aspect of our inheritance and one that we lose at our peril. I mean, that's why I think the image of the wig is so striking, that the idea that at the moment that you go into this particular space, the ludicrous, in a literal sense, item of the wig signifies a seriousness of a very particular kind and quite unlike the realm of quotidian life. So I think it's linked in Huizinga, I think, to his concern about what we might otherwise talk about as secularization. That contemporary culture is threatened by the loss of the sacred, the loss of the sense of the sacred, which he sees as inextricably linked to this play spirit. So we end up being caught up in an arid and sterile pseudo-seriousness in a society that's overwhelmed by a sort of utilitarian aspect and which has lost the sense of the affirmation of life, which he finds expressed beautifully in certain medieval traditions.
I had a question regarding your discussion of the spoil sport versus the cheat, and it seems to me that the cheat is a greater threat to the game, given that it upsets the trust surrounding it. But I wonder if perhaps you're thinking that the spoil sport in some way upsets the game itself versus the trust among players.
Well, the point about the spoil sport is linked to the significance of imagination for the idea of play in Huizinga. So what the spoil sport does is destroy the necessary illusion of the game. I had a son like this who'd we'd be playing a game, and he'd when he was losing, he's very competitive. When we were losing, he'd suddenly say, "I'm not playing anymore," right? And he'd just ruin the game. And Huizinga is pointing to the fact that the link between ludus and illusion, that etymological link. And I think this is quite fascinating, that there's something about the imaginative dimension of play, whether that's in sport, where you know that those rules are artificial. I mean, when that boy at rugby school famously, picked up the ball, that was a break of the rules. Of course, that ended up to produce another game, rather close to what you call football over here. But nevertheless, that the significance of the shared imaginary for play is that which is being stressed by Huizinga, and the significance of the spoil sport is that he's destroying that necessary illusion, that suspended disbelief that is required for the, as it were, the serious absorption in the play.
That was a wonderful, magnificent talk. I'm only sorry I'm not going to be here for the rest of them. Your discussion of play and the kind of question of its relation to seriousness and to idleness reminded me, and this may be something you're going to be bringing out later, that Homer in some ways has already cottoned on to some of these questions. When we think about the place of the games in Book 23 of the Iliad, and that they're placed in the context of a funeral, so that the moment of that freedom is at the same time the recognition of the seriousness, indeed, the mortality of the human. And of course, in the Aeneid, they're also placed in that context. But I'm especially thinking about the moment in the Odyssey when Odysseus is among the Phaeacians, and he has kept himself secret. They don't know who he is. But there's one Phaeacian addresses him and sees that he has wept, sees that he has suffered, and mocks him for being a kind of merchant, a sea trader, engaged in nothing but negotiation. And relative to his sense of freedom and that the Phaeacians don't have to work. And then that Homer has Odysseus out-throw him. And to my mind, that's the sense in which we can bring that suffering into that freedom. And then the games are entirely different. They're not idle, empty, vacuous things that these leisured classes simply part. Does that connect with what you've been talking about?
Oh, I think definitely, and I think that's very much in the spirit of Huizinga's work. And by the way, I think I always feel rather uncomfortable with these secular funerals that one experiences in the UK, and I'm sure in North America as well, as celebrations of life. And I feel, no, it's a sad occasion, it's a funeral, that's really, and alongside the loss of the liturgy and the beauty of the language, I always find it troubling to be listening to some celebration of the deceased's life. But of course, in a way, a funeral is an affirmation of life. And I think the significance of these rituals in human existence as having a play-like quality, because of course the obvious utility is not there, and yet it corresponds to a very deep need for that recognition of the sacredness of life. So in a way, I think that image of the funeral and the link between the game and the funeral is precisely the aspect that he feels is lost to a contemporary secular or increasingly secular culture. Thank you.
You mentioned regarding the Whig culture of maybe the English court, and that reminded me of Tocqueville talks about in his advice to religions continuing in democratic America to avoid empty formalism, because democratic citizens don't want to play these types of games. They want kind of the meat. And I wonder if this raising to self-consciousness of the play sort of destroys the play, that once you become aware that it is a game, it's hard to take it seriously. So I wonder if you had anything to say about just the self-consciousness of play, and something that especially is prevalent in America, irony as a type of play that is both, it's sort of a, well, yeah, what do you ever have to say about irony?
So if I'm right, there are two issues there. So one is the erosion of certain play structures, and it doesn't even make sense to try to replicate them or maintain them in that cultural context. And the second point is irony. Is that right? So about the first, my thought is basically that we are ritual creatures. We need rituals. And if we lose certain traditional rituals, we'll often replace them with substitutes. And of course, one of the points that Huizinga is making is that we have a very rich tradition of rituals that once you appreciate the significance of the play spirit, then you can recognize the value of these rituals in human life. By the way, it seems to me that one of the reasons why I find this topic so fascinating is the link between the question of our nature as animals and yet the fact that we are very strange animals indeed. And this, of course, is a theme in ancient philosophy, that the human being is amphibious, is in a way belonging to two worlds. That we could say, of course, without bringing metaphysics into it or theology even, we could say, well, maybe just physis and nomos, maybe just nature and culture. And so that very often the most natural aspects of human life are radically different from any other form of animal life. For example, the meal. No other animal has a meal. And yet, of course, the meal is such a characteristically ritualized activity. And maybe for natural reasons has to be, because any other animal, if it bares the teeth and looks at the other animal in the eyes, it's just about to attack. Right? So we're the only animals who show our teeth and can look at each other in that way. So ritual is a very significant part of human life. And irony, it seems to me, is also extremely significant, because often precisely because of this double nature, this aspect of us that Pascal used to dwell upon so beautifully, and which of course goes back to the ancients, that we're both frail animals with complex creatures, and yet we're also part of a cultural world of a very rich inheritance. So irony seems to me to be extremely important in this context, and irony was an aspect of culture which Huizinga saw lacking in the totalitarianism of his own period, of course, of book burnings, of works of literature being hidden, destroyed, or edited. And some might think that there's elements of this going on at the moment.
If my memory is correct in the Glass Bead Game, those who live in Castalia are actually forbidden, or at least strongly discouraged from composing their own new music, yep, or making new scientific or mathematical discoveries. They just had to kind of use the contents of the intellectual tradition, yep, as pieces in the game that they were playing. So what do you think? Do you think it's possible that Hesse is commenting not so much on the dangers of play or games per se, but on play kind of in that sterilized context?
Well, I think there's obviously a sense of the German title is the Glasperlenspiel, so the glass bead game, Glasperlenspiel. I think he's constructing this world of brilliance and yet sterility at the same time. And so it's a model of what a university should not be. So that's I think that lends credence to the theme of a number of commentators that this is a critique of the Mandarin culture of German intellectuals in the 1930s. But nevertheless, Hesse himself is a rather complex figure. He comes out of this great tradition in the southwest of Germany that produced Hegel, Schelling, Hölderlin, Schiller. So he's very conscious of the riches of that tradition, and as it were at the same time this perversion or sterile form of it that he's creating in this imaginary world. So I think it's a nuanced presentation of Castalia, I think, in the novel.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pull on the Platonist inside of you. We were reading last week the affinity argument. This is the Phaedo 77E. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about how driving out the child, driving out play, and here, this is going to get a little in the weeds about the lexicon. We were still a little concerned about what in Plato he's trying to drive out. The word is ex ap ado, to charm away. So like it's also the use of music and singing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He's talking here about the boogeyman, this fear, the thing that has fear. So I'm curious to hear, A, your read of Plato, although I admit that's incredibly dangerous, and B, I just want to hear your thoughts on what do you think he's saying to drive out the fear of the boogeyman or the child that fears the boogeyman?
Well, I'm not quite sure what your question is about.
Well, because you started out children playing, and that proper play leads to serious beings. But if we drive out the child, are we not playing? Are we not integrating the child by driving out the child, that same child that's supposed to play properly?
Well, I think that Plato himself is, of course, the poet who's producing semi-comic dramas with tragic elements. I mean, obviously, Socrates is at one level a tragic figure. I mean, he's sentenced to death unfairly. At the same time, Socrates is a comic figure. And you could say, of course, he doesn't fit in to the aristocratic model of the kalos kagathos, that he's not the the beautiful, charming figure of Alcibiades. He's this midwife. He's the he's this curious, puzzling, comic figure. Now, in that sense, I think Plato is particularly in the Symposium rather than the Phaedo. The Phaedo is more concentrating on the tragic side. The Symposium, we have certainly a mixture, quite explicitly, of comic and tragic elements. And Huizinga is struck by a phrase in the Laws, where he talks about humanity as the paignion theou, as the plaything, the toy of the deity. And of course, one way of interpreting that would be that of King Lear, right? So humanity is just because of misery and suffering in life and injustice and whatever, the plaything in a negative sense. But that, of course, is not what Plato in the Laws wants to emphasize. And Huizinga thinks there's this positive sense of seeing ourselves as playthings of the divine, but in this sense of affirming life, notwithstanding the tragic and notwithstanding suffering. So I think the account of play that Huizinga is drawing on is actually very rich and significant for understanding the Platonic oeuvre.
Yeah, if I could just move back a little bit. I agree with your points on the Symposium. I mean, he does say, he asked that question between can the same man write a tragedy and a comedy? So I completely agree on you there. And maybe you can't read Plato because, it's coming through Socrates. But my question still remains that he's very unclear about whether he's saying you're meant to drive out the child or are you meant to drive out the fear. So my question to you is that if play is so important, do you drive out that child or do you integrate the child so that they play properly? Or do you say, no, after a certain point, you don't play?
Well, I would tend to I would tend to see it as a sort of dialectical relationship between the spude and the paideia, between the seriousness and the play, and that I think is not a matter of driving the child out. After all, the child is the father of the man, as a great English poet once said, and so perhaps driving out the child is not a good thing, but certainly integrating play with seriousness, I think, is part of that Platonic project, and certainly to be contrasted with the sort of bogus seriousness that Huizinga is criticizing in his work.
First of all, thank you very much. And I just remembered, I couldn't wait to come here because my very first boss when I was a lawyer many years ago, when he'd asked me to work late one night, I remember groaning and he said, "But work is an adult's playtime." And he truly lived by that. And it wasn't until many years later when I started studying Eastern religions and philosophy, contemplation, learning about everything is an illusion, everything is a dream. And so then it seemed to me that then the goal was to view everything is to live within this context of everything being imagination, illusion, and play. Whether it was serious or not, it fell into that hopper. So my question then is, where did we get this separateness in our culture, this separation in our culture, where we think of, work as an adult's playtime? No, my 25-year-old self did not believe that. It was work and it was play. And I think that's still very much a part of what we think in our society? Is it due to the fact that we define productivity in a certain way, and the way we define productivity therefore influences what we think is play or isn't play? And also maybe just a concept of mindfulness.
Okay, so thank you very much. So on the first point, I mean, I'll come to this in a later lecture. Actually, there are two interesting notions of play in the Eastern tradition. One is that in Advaita, Vedanta, and to some extent in some forms of Buddhism, where play is associated with Maya in the way that you were suggesting, with illusion, right? But interestingly, in the more theistic Indic tradition, the notion of lila or play is actually not associated with this realm of illusion, but actually with God's gift, with the beneficence of God as being a playful spontaneity, right? So what God gives us in the world is not like a craftsman, but in fact is like a sort of overflowing. There are interesting parallels with Aquinas in this respect. But I think to the second and more serious point that you're raising, I think it has to do with the notion of the Homo economicus, with the vision of life as centrally and perhaps exclusively economic. Now, I'm a great admirer, and I think there's much to be admired with what the Western world has done through what is often referred to as capitalism, and the great achievements in the removal of much of poverty and the increase in health and living standards for human beings, I think is an extraordinary achievement of Western culture. However, alongside those immense material advances, I think there's often been a concomitant claim that this is all that human happiness consists in. Whereas, of course, I would say that the explosion in mental health problems, whatever we mean by mental health, is a symptom of some of the issues of the human condition that are not addressed by this remarkable increase in wealth, this conquest of many forms of disease that plagued our ancestors. And so that's a sense in which I think the notion of the Homo economicus linked in contemporary culture with a deadly bureaucratic approach to life, which I think we saw recently in the Western world in relation to the government measures in the wake of the COVID, that this heavy-handed administrative approach to life with little sense of the human dimension and the sacred and spiritual dimension of human life, that I think is the real issue that we need to be concerned with.
I wanted to dig a little deeper into Dr. Blackwood's question from the beginning, basically about how play as a necessity, if one is deprived of that, they lack a certain development. Do you think there are any remedies that can be done for adults who have been affected by that to reintegrate them back into a proper developmental stage? And if so, do you have any idea what they would be?
Well, that's an extremely large and serious question, but I think broadly it is linked to the significance of the imagination in our lives. And one standard way of dealing with this is to contrast fantasy as something negative and imagination as being a positive aspect of human consciousness, so that the engagement with the arts, for example, is particularly healthy for adult human beings, precisely because it offers an arena of the imagination that we all need. I mean, it seems to me one of the paradoxes here is that to be able to negotiate with other adults, we need to employ the imagination, not in the sense of some fantastical sense, but simply to understand what is going on in, let's say, a situation of conflict or a situation of misunderstanding, or particularly a situation where another agent is troubled or suffering deeply, or maybe has some psychological problem. And what we find with the greatest artists, with a Dante, or with a Shakespeare, or with a Goethe, is we encounter reality. However peculiar the figures that we read or hear about in those great artists are nevertheless depictions of real human beings with all that complexity that I mentioned earlier, these strange amphibious beings who are at the same time animals, like any other item in the animal kingdom, and yet inhabiting a world of culture, and indeed from a religious perspective, a spiritual domain. So we need the imagination to grasp certain facts about the world. And in that sense, I think we all need that, and particularly the psychologically troubled, for whatever reason, individual needs that particularly sorely.
What a wonderful beginning to what I know is going to be a wonderful series. Next week, same time, same place. Join me in thanking Professor Hedley for this lecture.